Okay, good morning, everybody. Thank you very much for joining. We're having a slight little technical difficulty in that Sunil can't have his video on, so I will do the introductions and then I shall try and figure that out in the background as Sunil starts to make his way through his presentation. So thank you very much for joining. Today we're speaking about future-proofing FM with regards to climate risk implications on property. So just a very quick overview for any of you who aren't aware. The SFMI is the Sustainable Facilities Management Index, and we're here to drive leadership within the FM industry. And we do this by delivering a range of sustainable services for the positive benefits across the value chain. And we believe that FM is in a kind of a linchpin pivotal role in order to have a positive impact on both the environment and society, because it can impact its value chain from the supply chain side, but then also into the customer and into the customer angle. And it can it can influence operation and maintenance of buildings. It can influence people's behaviours on the ground as well, while also influencing purchasing decisions of all of the different equipment that it brings in, the goods and services. And also it can deliver social value as well, because obviously FM is a very people-heavy industry. So we believe it's perfectly positioned in order to have an impact. Today's speaker is Sunil Shah, Managing Director of Aclara Advisory. So Sunil has 25 years of experience in the built environment, and has worked across the building life cycle as well. So he has a great wealth of knowledge running from the planning, construction, as well as the operational side of the building life cycle. So Sunil is the owner and founder of Aclara Advisory and established the SFMI 9 years ago. So some key things, I guess, as I mentioned, the purpose of the SFMI is to drive ESG leadership in the industry. And we do this by delivering sustainable services, but not all. We don't only work one-to-one with FM providers. We also do an array of work around research and kind of working with industry bodies as well. For example, helping IWFM with their sustainability competency framework in order to help educate FM workers of today and tomorrow. We also influenced and worked, contributed to the RICS Responsible Business Framework, and have also been working on our own research as well, which is being launched on the 8th of June, so one to look out for, which is the Scope 3 in FM, measurement of Scope 3 in FM report. This has been worked on for since last year, and will help to set the standard for FM providers to be measuring their emissions, but then also engaging with their clients in order to influence the emissions, which can be influenced within the contracts that they deliver. Here's a quick look at the partners of organisations that support us and work with us as well. So we have an array of businesses from both the FM side and also into the client side. So Sunil, I'm going to hand over to you now. And while I'm doing that, I'm also trying see if the camera can get sorted out in the background.
Fantastic. Thanks very much, Chris. And good afternoon, everyone. For those of you who have met me before, then you're probably glad that you can't see a face of me as well. But if you want to go on to the next slide, Chris. So I'm just going to start touching upon the subjects and the areas around climate change. And I think going back to where I started off, one of the early stages in my career was working a lot with the Met Office and looking at some of the infrastructure issues that would be taking place from climate change back some 20 odd years ago. And we did a modelling, we looked at what the future implications would be and set out some of the key risks and challenges that would be taking place in 2020, and then also looking slightly further ahead. A lot of the time, we were told that the responses that were given for 2020 was extremist, was a bit over the top. Pretty much everything that we suggested would happen in terms of climatic variations, in terms of weather events and one-off major events occurring, is now happening and has happened over the last few years. And then the implications that are moving on start to become a bit more stark in terms of the effects and the impacts that they'll have as well. So the IPCC has been running a series of reports from 2018 onwards, starting to talk around how, let's see if this works, starting to impact on how climate change will affect not only the environment, but the latest suite of IPCC reports are talking about the societal impacts that will come as well. And the most recent one from the World Meteorological Organization is talking about a 50-50 chance of hitting 1.5 degrees in the next 5 years. So bearing in mind, when we were doing Paris agreements, that time, the early stages was 2030 timeframe to be hitting 1.5. So within the last 5-7 years, we've already brought that level forwards quite significantly. So a lot of what we're dealing with now is saying some of these changes are definitely going to happen. So how do we provide that necessary mitigation? To do that, we need to better understand what the likely impacts are going to be. Yeah. Next slide, please, Chris. So, was that 2 or 1? Okay. So in terms of some of the implications and the impacts, next slide. The impacts that are likely to come through. So here we're starting to look at what the weather events are likely to be, but also some of those cumulative impacts will be as well. Chris, is this in share view, or is this just on a screen?
Just on the screen.
Okay.
Yeah, it should. I thought I had it on. Yeah, I have it on.
Okay. So the weather events that we're seeing, so having a look in India at the minute, peak temperatures there getting towards 48 degrees. We've already had implications on individuals being able to work outside and the length of time that they can work. But I think one of the other knock-on effects is India was one of the world's largest wheat providers and exported an awful lot of wheat externally and outside of its borders. The heat has impacted yields by around 30%, which means that last week India took the decision that it wasn't going to be exporting any wheat outside of its borders because it was focusing more upon making sure that its own population had enough food available. That has then had a direct implication on wheat prices, but also the provision of food externally as well. And we're going to start to see some of these impacts where climatic variations will start to increasingly impact upon food availability, but also availability of individuals to then be working as well. Extreme heats, not only in India, but also in North America as well, and the implications that it has then on human life as well, but also the decisions that are being made. So in California, conversations around either working and having heat stress or going without pay. So the implications for business then is quite significant. We're talking about future implications where up to 1 billion people may be affected by not being able to work externally and also being under heat stress under a constant basis. And even the US administration is starting to put in measures and programs in place to manage heat stress. So currently, you've got the likes of California, Minnesota, Washington that already have standards in place for outdoor working and heat stress working. So it's already an activity and an action that's been in place. From an FM perspective, how do we treat that as well for staff that are going to be working externally, for staff that are going to be driving as well? How do we ensure that we manage that heat stress issue that could be affecting them. Next slide, please. So looking at temperature profiling and what that could be moving out into the future. So this is some of the modelling which is taking place by the IPCC as part of its next suite of reports that are going to be taking place during the summer months. And we're looking at options from SSP1, which is saying everything's looking quite good and we're reducing emissions quite significantly, towards a SSP2, which is saying it's more of a business as usual type activity with the reductions that are put in place, right the way up to a number 5, which is saying it's business as usual today without implementation of any of the changes or actions that are taking place. So you've got this quite significant spread. If we move towards the 2050 timeline, we're still talking about temperature changes of between 1.5 and 2.5 within that bandwidth of 2050. Next slide. So looking at what that means and some of the implications that we have in here. So this is the policies that are in place and the reason why not just the policies that are coming in place, but also the delivery of those policies becomes so important. So we start to talk around what the current policy agreements are, and that takes us towards a 2.6 and 2.7 degree rise. If we then overlay the promises that have been made, both by countries and by organisations, it takes us down to about a 1.8. So we have that delta of around 0.8 degrees, which is based not on policies and regulatory side, but is based more on commitments and promises that have been made both by governmental and by organisations. So that there is a need to drive through those additional promises which aren't regulated to make sure that they do happen and they do take place. Next slide. So when we start to look here then in terms of what will the climatic changes mean and what will occur from it. So this is some modelling again that's taken place on a degree by degree basis. So it shows at the top what the simulated change and the actual changes for a 1 degree world. And by and large, what we're saying is the northern hemisphere is going to warm up significantly more than the southern hemisphere, primarily because there's an awful lot more land mass in the north than there is in the south. So moving towards what we're expecting to see, which will be a 2 degree, between a 1.5 and 2 degree world, then we're starting to see that implications starting to add up quite a lot. So northern hemisphere will be going up by some 4 to 6 degrees as a result of that. So that means that there's also going to be significant warming of the glacial regions, which are up there, the permafrost regions, which are up there as well. And it will start to have knock-on effects then in terms of what's going to happen to those countries from a warming perspective. Next slide, please. Okay. So in terms of what that looks like and what that means for from a workforce perspective, we've got a couple of charts here. One is showing India and in particular the number of lost hours of working, and then the other one is showing into Europe as well. And the reasons for having these is this is a good description in terms of the implications from a property and FM perspective. So outdoor working temperatures that are going to be above 34 degrees C, which means that dangerous heat levels, which will affect the ability of people to be able to physically be out in those kinds of temperatures, let alone be working. There's a significant amount of time, so getting towards 50% of time will be lost, particularly during summer months, within India being able to physically work. So that's not just in buildings, but it's also in the agricultural space. It will be in some of the manufacturing space, etc. as well. And we start to see something similar when we look at Europe as well, where we're starting to see 60% plus of months, that's 5 months or 6 months each year, will be under drought conditions in Spain and some of the Mediterranean areas. But also if we look at the UK, this will be next decade, 3 months every year will be under drought conditions. So that'll be minimum rainfall events taking place. Again, what that means in terms of biodiversity coverage, grounds management, but also in terms of heat stress on buildings, and also when we start to look at the infrastructure, that becomes quite significant. So starting to look at the forward measures that will be affecting the infrastructure and grounds activities. Next slide. So when we start to look at the implications and the impacts that we have, so the key areas that we look at from a climate perspective focuses around two things. One is the transition risks, which are based upon the policies, the technology that's there, and also what consumers, employees, etc. are looking for, and their drive and their changing behaviours. But it's also the physical risks that we look at. So the physical risks revolve around chronic, as in they're always there, or acute, which is the one-offs. And both of those two are moving quite significantly. So we now have changed the way that rainfall events now occur within the UK. We now have slightly drier summers, and we do have warmer, wetter winters. More freak or acute weather patterns that are occurring in winter, high rainfall events that are occurring, causing localized flooding, and then during the summer months, temperature rises, which become quite significant. What that means as we look through the economic transition is what does that look like? How does that manifest itself in terms of impacts upon individuals and upon assets as well? And then there's an ability to be able to capture and classify that under the various financial risks. But I think one of the key areas that we need to look at from a property and an FM perspective is what does that mean in terms of legal liability? So there is a responsibility in terms of the provision of space and a workplace environment that is being provided. So particularly from a leased environment, if you're not able to provide a space that is comfortable and is workable, how does that infringe upon the lease arrangements that are being provided within that building? And that, as a risk perspective, becomes greater and greater year on year. And we will start to get to a point where we'll have a scenario that says a building can no longer be occupied, or a leased building can no longer be occupied because of the temperature within the space itself. Whose liabilities does that start to sit on when you need to look at swing space, or you need to look at changing activities? Is that the occupier's cost, or is that the landlord cost? So some of these then become forward measures that we need to look at, even if we're only looking at 5-year leases moving ahead. Next slide. Okay, so what does all of this mean, and what do we need to do moving forward? So there is a climate framework which has been set up called the TCFD, the Task Force for Climate Finance Related Disclosure. And as a framework, it provides the perfect way of being able to capture a lot of what we've been talking about, the forward risks, the forward issues, and being able to structure that from an FM perspective. Whilst the TCFD is meant for an organisational level, so it does talk about governance, strategy, risk, and metrics, which are aligned with the enterprise programs for an organisation. From a property real estate perspective, we can also start to look at the TCFD for the risks and issues that will affect our own operations, and to be able to move that information upwards in terms of the risks and the implications that will take place. Next slide. So in looking in particular then at that strategy, risk, and the metrics area, we are looking here at starting off with having a robust understanding in terms of what the greenhouse gas emissions are, but more importantly it's not just the what, but it's also the how and the why. So why does the business generate those emissions, and where's the opportunity to be able to modify and change them as well? Because we're going to use that knowledge that will then feed into the risk side of things. And the risk side of things start to talk around what's the ability of being able to moderate and change, but also where's the opportunities that come out. And I think from an FM side, we should see this as being an opportunity more than a risk. This is about how do we provide solutions to enable buildings to continue to operate so that organisations operate and also the assets retain their value as well. So it's forward looking, it's making sure that we're only talking 10 years ahead, in some cases 5 or 6 years ahead. So we're starting to ask the questions around what does this mean in terms of capital investments that will affect into the future. Next slide. And in terms of that overall approach, we have an initial stage which looks at climate screening, which is the 4 key areas. So understanding what does and how does the TCFD operate, what kind of information already exists that you put out in the public domain around risks and approaches and management and data, series of interviews that takes place to understand what information and data is already going on that's not been publicised, and then provision of a lot of that in terms of how do you manage the overall programme and where do you need to work to be able to fill those gaps into the future. So that initial climate screening stage allows you to understand where you are, what some of your key issues are, but also what does that look like from an organisational perspective. We then move forwards then into second and third stage around scenario analysis, and then also into future strategy stage as well. Yeah. Next. And then, so the final slide then is about what does this look like and how does climate risk fit in with everything else? So climate risk is not a subject area in its own right. It does feed in as part of the overall ESG program. So there's a number of knock-on and sequential parts attached to this that you'll also be leading on in other areas as well. So the technical part of it, so that's the purchasing side of things, the key areas in terms of other asset type activities going on, renewable energy, building fabric technologies, nature-based solutions, etc. will have a direct program of management and measurement attached to them. And then vice versa on the cultural side, which is around how the business operates, we then look at the data, the well-being of staff, etc., which will become key parts of the climate risk issue, but also key parts of other elements of FM service delivery and an organisational operational model as well. Yeah. Next slide. Thank you very much. So that's, I think we've still got about 6 or 7 minutes Q&A and other bits and pieces. But that was, quick run through on climate risk. Big subject area, but it's really starting to look at initial stages. How do you currently understand it and what do you currently do before then building on from there?
Brilliant. That's probably one of the most well-timed bite-sized webinars that we've had. Well done. So I had a couple of questions come through. So one question, what can workplace and FM do to help become the agents for change, in your opinion?
Yeah. So I think that there is a need for upskilling within the sector. So at the minute, it's a situation of not doing anything because we don't know what to do. So the key initial part is about that upskilling piece. It's about understanding what the future risks and implications are, because the ask of the FM sector now is to not go along the lines of the finance director saying we're going to do like-for-like replacements, or this has been the same capital budget that you've had before, or your procurement, the CPO saying you've got to cut cost on service provision. Instead, we're now saying, here's some risks that are going to be affecting your building. And there's options about how you want to go. We can go down the traditional route, but that will lead to a devaluation in your property and may lead to the building not being able to support the workforce within it. Or we can go a different way and start to invest slightly or look at a different way of how we provide services within the building that do align with the climate risk modelling that has taken place. So certainly it's about understanding the subject, it's about understanding what the risks are, but it's about that optioneering as well. Because at the end of the day, the difficult decisions are there for the senior managers to make. And this will require a different approach. It may not require significant changes in capital investment, but it will require a different approach for how we manage our buildings and services.
And what additional skills do you think the sector needs to bring to acquire in order to be taking this more strategic approach?
Yeah. So I think there's a number of different areas on this. I think one part is certainly around the life cycle understanding. So coming from a background where I sat across the building life cycle, there's a huge silo mentality that exists between the delivery side, which is the design construction bits and physically getting the building sent out, and the management part of it, which is about operating a building successfully for the forward generations. And there's a massive disconnect that exists between those two parts. But to successfully communicate about what the needs are, both in terms of where the problem's handed to you and how to resolve them, is an understanding of both of those two parts. So there is an element of learning across the life cycle that's going to be needed. And then the other key skill part is around how do we communicate upwards. So there's a lot of knowledge and information that's captured. There's a lot of understanding around what the implications are in terms of delivery of existing models that are in place. How do we communicate that up towards the finance director, towards CPA, so that there's an understanding of the risks that are going to be in place? So does this form part of the enterprise risk management system? Do we understand how the ERP works so that we can feed into it from that risk perspective? So that disconnect currently means majority of senior managers don't see running of buildings then as being a critical factor. The COVID scenario helped to ameliorate that somewhat, but I think in general terms, there's still a need to talk about some of the forward challenges.
Brilliant. All right. Thank you very much. I think we're approaching the last final minute. So with that said, just a very quick update on what's coming up for the SFMI over the course of the coming month. So on the 7th of June, we will be having an SFMI Leaders Forum, which will have us discuss the 23 criteria that companies are being assessed against and the updates to that, as well as what's in store for the programme ahead. And that's open not just to the current FM providers, but also those organisations who are interested and keen to be a part of us. So please do let us know if you're interested in joining that. 8th of June, look out for the launch of the SFMI Scope 3 and FM standard. This will be going on our website and will also be launched at the IWFM conference, in fact, and then we'll be also working on discussing this report over the course of the June month and July as well. We're also keen to hear from companies who are interested in taking part in stage 2 of this project as well. So please do get in touch with me, chris.havers at aclaro-advisory.com. I'll put the details in the chat function. And then also, we did have a leaders forum a couple of months ago based on water management. So we are also releasing 3 mini reports off the back of that as well. So thank you very much to those who took part in that waters forum. And the FMJ Facilities Management Journal will be releasing those across the summer as a continued part. So keep an eye out for those, and also keep an eye out for other articles that we're planning on being released around the Scope 3 report as well. And then also we will be starting our SFMI assessments as well. So I'll be reaching out to companies to be confirming their participation in those basically in the afternoon today. So look out for an email from me. So thank you very much, everybody. Thank you very much, Sunil. And we will be posting this webinar on YouTube. And if you're keen to have the slides, pop me a quick email. Thank you very much. I'm going to put my email address in the chat right now. Enjoy the rest of your day, everyone.
Thanks very much, Chris. Thanks very much, everyone.